I am Travis Wright. I am a researcher and scholar serving in Bible translation and excited to be here.
I am proud to say this is Dr. Travis Wright. Last time you were with us, Travis, you were not a doctor. You were getting ready to defend, as I recall.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It was far less painful than I thought it would be.
Oh, good, good. Graduated from Cambridge in, was it 24, was it, or 23?
Yeah, that's right. Last September.
Last September. All right, great. Well, you've been with us before. We'll put, last time you were with us, you talked about John chapter 1, verse 18, and that sometimes people say controversial phrase, but the only begotten God, that particular translation of that, which I'm convinced is the right one, which is a kind of an early Trinitarian thing, I believe.
Yeah.
Anyway, today we're going to talk about something else altogether here on Exegetically Speaking, and that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 5. Set that up for us.
Yeah, so here Paul's giving an exhortation just in the preface of the letter, describing the relationship between Christ's suffering and the comfort that we experience. But there's a bit of an irony here that's really interesting to look at in Greek.
Okay. Well, let's do that. Why don't you read it for us in Greek, and we'll hear it, and then you can come back, give us your own translation, and we can talk a little bit about that irony.
Yeah. Kathos perisevi ta pathimata tu Christu isimas, utos dia tu Christu perisevi, ke paraklisis imon.
Very good. Very good. All
And
right.
so my translation would be, even as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so also through Christ, comfort also abounds.
All right. So on the one hand, sufferings, pathemata. On the
Right.
other hand, paraklesis.
Yeah, that's right. And what I wanted to discuss, that I thought was really interesting, is actually the word pathimata. It's a plural of the word pathima, which is to suffer. And what's so fascinating about this, and where we have a bit of a mismatch between English and Greek, is that this is actually what's called a mass noun in linguistics. And English does something really different here with our mass nouns than you would do actually in ancient and modern Greek as well. So a mass noun is something that's uncountable. You could think like milk, sand, advice, water. You can't say like four milks, seven sands. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? And it's
Mm-hmm.
because it's an uncountable substance. Whereas count nouns would be things you could count, like apples or computers or swords. You could have 12 of those or nine of those or whatever. But what's interesting is we don't pluralize mass nouns in English unless we're trying to talk about different kinds of something or different multiple instances of something.
Hmm.
But Greek's a little bit different, that it has a third thing that's called an abundance inference. So they can pluralize mass nouns when they talk about a lot of something.
Hmm.
So a really good example of this is in English, we would never say something like waters are dripping.
Hmm.
That just sounds bizarre. But that's exactly what you can say in modern Greek. You can say trechou nera, waters are dripping.
Hmm.
But a Greek will hear that as a lot of water is dripping
In other words,
because
not just drop, drop, but a kind of a flood of water.
yeah, just like drop, 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 drop.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of water that's dripping. And so it's actually making the word water plural, which we don't do in English, that creates that abundance inference.
Hmm.
And this is what's interesting is that in English, if we were to make the word water plural, if I was to say something to you like, hey, grab me three waters, it has to mean three bottles of water,
Hmm.
or it has to mean three different types of water, like spring, tap, so on and so forth.
Fizzy water.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So Greek has that. It has the types and it has the different instances like bottles, but it has a third thing we don't have in English. If you pluralize the word suffering in English and say sufferings, you cannot hear that as a lot of suffering. You have to hear it as different kinds or as different multiple instances of suffering.
Hmm.
But I think what's happening here in 2 Corinthians 1:5 is that Paul, by making the word pathema plural, he says ta pathemata to Christu, the suffering of Christ, but it's plural. I think he's talking about the abundance of suffering, which would
Mm,
make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? Because he also uses the verb perisevi. It abounds, it's overflowing in
mm,
some way. And so I think this is a really good example of how we can look at modern Greek, which if you go back to the philologists of ancient Greek,
yeah.
Moulton, Robertson, and others, they were studying modern Greek and then going back to ancient Greek, to Koine Greek, to see is there a similarity because the language is remarkably stable. So there's precedent for this when we go to modern Greek and say, well, Greeks hear it this way. And we go back to the New Testament and we say, well, hold on, why would you make that word plural? And I think here it's because there is that abundance inference. And so the ESV translates this as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings. It should be the other way around. It should be that we share in the abundance of Christ's sufferings, I think. That if there is an abundance inference, because
Mm.
you made the mass noun plural, it's the abundance of his sufferings, not the abundance of our sharing necessarily.
Oh, that's a
Another way to
great
say it.
point. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah,
Interesting to
our
me
sharing
that,
abounds.
yeah, it's interesting to me that the paraklesis there is a singular
Right.
as opposed
Yep.
to the plural pathemata.
Right. That's right. Our sharing abounds because his suffering abounded first. I think
Yeah,
that's Paul's point,
yeah.
which is really, really fascinating here.
Well, that takes us over to Romans chapter 8, verse
Right.
1, because you see a little bit of a crossover here, maybe?
Yeah, in verse 18.
Oh, sorry, 8:18. Yeah.
So Paul does the same thing. He has tapathemata here. And not every time you make a mass noun plural, it has to mean abundance. So I'm not saying that. Sometimes
Hmm.
it is kinds or multiple instances. So, the Peter says, the sufferings of Christ were predicted. I think that would be the different kinds of suffering that he underwent. But here, what's interesting is Paul says that I think that the suffering of this present age, tapathemata, is not worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. And so when we
Hmm.
translate this into English, anytime you see a plural mass noun in Greek, you have to make a decision about what kind of inference you think it has, because that'll affect what you do in English. Because again, in English, we can't make it plural and get the same kind of implication. So the question here would be, what is not worth comparison? Is it the kind of suffering, the multiple instances of it, or is it the abundance of the suffering that's not worth comparing? And I think it's probably not the kinds or multiple instances, but Paul's actually saying that there's an irony here, isn't there, that this age is characterized by an abundance of suffering. We all know that. And Paul's point is, despite that fact, the abundance of suffering that we experience in this age isn't even worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. And that's where that irony, that contrast comes in. For as much as we suffer in this life, not even worth comparing. It's not a fair fight if we were to put it next to the glory that's going to
Hmm.
be revealed to us in the age.
And that's a fascinating reading. Travis Wright, Dr. Travis Wright, thanks for being with us today on
Yeah.
Exegetically Speaking.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Travis Wright. I like the sound of it. This is his third time with us on Exegetically Speaking. He'll be back. You too can become a master of biblical languages like Travis. Wheaton College, that's all you need to know. The best faculty, the best program, the best facility, and the best setting for studying biblical languages anywhere in the lower 48. Thanks to our editor, my wife Kathy Capes. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Thanks to John Lonsma, Jesse Dugan, Rebecca Larson, our Wheaton-based team, for their helps. Is that a mass noun? For their helps in producing this podcast. Only 168 hours until the next podcast drops. Until next time, I'm David Capes for the Linear Theological Library. Thank you for listening.